Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to prototype number 56, in fact, and we are shaking the earth. That is, of course, a reference to one of the lines that the Optecton has, and the Optecton is on your screen right now. Yes, that big bad boy, he's an Optecton, all right. Of course, I'm going to be updating the materials and probably the mesh in general a little bit in the next little while, like over the next week or so, before the next release anyway. But I have been cooking up some very exciting changes to the game, including the deployment of the new Hierophant and, of course, the new Optecton in terms of their models. So, you know, I was able to scrap together a quick show of a bunch of custom Protoss assets on the screen. I feel like that's good, you know, marketing, if you will, for indicating what the game is all about, and the fact that we have all of these custom graphics. Those are the things that really catch people's eyes, I think. But we've also just been trying to follow along for a bunch of things. We've been trying to improve the game in a bunch of ways, and of course audiovisuals help with that, but they're not the only thing that we've been up to. So one of our first sections coming up here is going to indeed be talking about the latest improvements and fixes, the latest things that we've discovered, the latest headway that we have made on big tasks like the iscript extender, and of course the resolution of those pesky desyncs. Besides that, though, we have a progress update for the Zerg tutorial. We've got a finals preview for the upcoming Throneroom. This weekend, actually, is going to be the last day of play for that tournament. It's gone on for a very long time, and I'm happy to bring it to a head. It's going to be exciting to see if maybe Hamster can repeat his conquest from the last year, and so on and so forth. But we'll get into that. We'll get into that. And other than that, I will close out the normal part of the show talking about balance considerations and some things that we're going to be changing from a game balance meta standpoint, etc. And of course, then we'll enter into the community roundup, the coffee questions, and close out the show from there. If you want to support content like this, if you want to support Cosmonarchy, if you want to support the work that we do here on this YouTube channel, on the No Frauds Club YouTube channel, and of course the community behind the No Frauds Club on Discord, well, you can join our Discord. You can subscribe to our channels. You can watch our content. You can share it with your friends and family. We got people's dads looking at stuff now. Dude, it's crazy. And of course, aside from all that, if you want to throw a couple bucks our way through our coffee page, you can do so. I'll even enable it in the bottom left there for you to see. Isn't that snazzy? Oh, it's gone now. It's gone. But it will always be there in the description. And if you donate, by the way, a brief little promotion that we're running is we're switching the tiers up a little bit to consolidate them. But if you decide to come in from now, even at a $3 a month premium, you will get access to the current secret project that we are building. Yes, we have secret dev streams. That's normally going to be a $12 a month value add. And of course, you'll also get the other perks like being able to chat with us in our separate donator section. We're starting to get way more Discord members now, so that might actually be important if you want to try to reach us in the future. Not that we'll always try to keep an ear to the ground community-wise, but it's still something worth doing. Is like if you really have a burning question and we're not monitoring every single message from every single channel. Like Veek already can't do that, and myself, I try to keep on top of things, but if I'm working or if I'm busy, then I obviously can't do that either. It's a lot easier to get my eyes on something and Veek's eyes on something if you end up sending it there. So anyway, just figured I'd mention that. We did indeed update the coffee tiers, so worth taking a look at. So appreciate you guys' support. Let's go on to talk about the Zerg tutorial. I thought I would be able to release it and talk about it in this episode, but unfortunately we did run into some AI layout issues. For those who are not aware, Cosmonarchy supports the ability for you to design your own build orders for your AI through using SCM Draft 2, the currently most powerful map editor, although it does have some pretty significant limitations and we don't have source access. So that kind of limits what we can do with it. But what we can do with it is still pretty impressive. We can create layouts. It's a work of Veek 7 to allow us to do that. We were able to essentially achieve loading in placeholders is like their internal name, another internal name for them. And these placeholders are considered like, oh, okay, I know that I should place this structure here. Now, you can do this a couple of different ways. One of the ways is that you can do it for, like, technically, even melee map makers could do this. They could say, I'm going to place some, watchdog and warden placements in this location at this base, and automatically they'd be assigned to the nearest resource area. So if you wanted to have them put them in, like, the the spots like behind the mineral line or something, that would be one thing that you could do. I'm going to place it for neutral, and I'm going to tick a flag that says the hallucinated flag, but we've replaced it in the editor with something else that indicates that this is a don't request flag. And so what that means is you would basically have this as a layout, and the AI would know that if I get a request for a watchdog or a warden or a pylon or whatever it is, then I should satisfy it here if I can. So if there's Kager there or a power field there and the structure requires that, then I can do it. And obviously if I have the tech requirements to do it, if you place a diadem in a certain location, well, they're not tier 3, then they won't be able to build it. But they also won't even request it if you tick the don't request flag there. And that's important because then it basically tells the AI, hey, I'm not telling you what to build. I'm just telling you that if you get this request, you should build it here. So prioritize building it here over the generic spot. And that can be pretty helpful in some situations. So even melee mappers could be using that. It is a lot of work, so I wouldn't necessarily expect them to. But that's like one use case, right? If you want to just run the default AI and you don't want to worry about designing their own build order and enabling it dynamically based on certain conditions and stuff, which is what I'm doing for the tutorials and other campaign content. But yeah, you can do a more stripped down version of it where you just say, hey, if you get this request, do this. And if you get that request, do that. And, put it here, right? That's sort of the idea. So you can imagine using it in a small way to just nudge the AI into something better, more performant for your particular map, something that performs better versus enemy play and is a little bit stronger or a little bit more, even just something maybe a little bit more thematic, like you want the Zerg to spread out their hatches or something. I don't know. Crazy stuff, right? You can do whatever you want, really. So it's very powerful as a system. However, it does seem like we ran into some issues that maybe never got fixed or regressed at some point. And because we don't have a lot of single-player content that uses this system, we didn't notice until it was sort of like time for me to say, all right, now I can test the final version of the map. And then like the AI just didn't work. So that was a little unfortunate. But it does mean that it gives us an opportunity to fix that issue, to make it better. Vika's been updating the code a lot, spending a lot of time trying to track down exactly what is going wrong. We do have some leads and stuff, so we can continue through that. And yeah, just something that we're going to continue fixing up and improving. That also means that because that's the only thing that I can realistically do at this point, like I can maybe make some minor tweaks to the triggers, but I can't really test all the triggers right now, like the dialogue events, until the AI is operational. And even then, from that point onward, I would still want to see if the AI, does that make sense in an actual live game where the AI is working properly? Then, okay, if that's the case, I'd still need to wait for the AI to work properly. So once the issues are quashed, I can get back to work on it. I'll be streaming development of it and stuff if it still needs that. But by the end of this week, I imagine we will definitely have it running. But since I'm development is kind of blocked on it for now, insofar as it's not like I'm actively still working on stuff, I have to wait for the bugs to be fixed. I have started to work on other things, and that's actually a reference back to the secret coffee dev streams, the exclusive stuff to our donors, where I've been streaming development of a project that we're keeping a tight ship on, as far as we're not letting it slip what it actually is yet. But it's a very exciting project, especially if you've been following the community that I've been building and the work that I've been doing for a length of time. Then it'll probably be pretty exciting to people. And, I'd post these cheeky, this is Three Crow's idea. I post these cheeky status updates that are like, hey, I did this and in a secret redacted version, project thing or whatever. And I post it and it's just censored by replacing every letter with U except for N. N is a different one. And then the numbers are, I guess I just keep the numbers there, but I was originally thinking maybe I should do the numbers be 3 instead of whatever number they actually were. I thought about that, but I decided against it. So you have 50 and stuff like that. Or I think I even kept the percentages and stuff. So you can kind of gather that progress is being made on some task, but you don't really know what it is. You could try to decipher it. There's a funny Lamino video recently where he was talking about some, I think it's Kryptos, some sort of puzzle that's at the CIA headquarters. And I thought it would be pretty funny to imagine somebody trying to crack the cipher here. What does it mean if it's U compared to just U? What does that mean? Yeah, those are the kinds of questions I want my audience asking. So anyway, that the kind of thing has been making the rounds, and that's been, because I've essentially finished work for now on the Zerg tutorial, I can move on to other single player content. So that's exciting. I've also been eyeing up the work that I've done on, Day of Blood, a Terran campaign where you actually play as the Upstart faction, which is sort of like a scrap cobbled military that replaces the Goliath with the Southpaw, which is another harassment unit you'd pair with a Vulture instead of being like a sort of iconic, sort of stolid unit that you would always build. And, it's not like an all-rounder. It's more specialized in some way. And then the Anseal gets replaced with the Wendigo. And the Wendigo is like a melee armor render and stuff. So it's like really wild. So yeah, there's a bunch of things that change up based on that. And I'm probably going to think about like replacing the phalanx with something else. I was actually thinking that maybe I'd replace the phalanx with it. For a long time, I've been thinking about a factional phalanx replacement that when they deploy, they fire a kinetic penetration shot and it would basically almost be like instant hit. And I feel like that would look really different compared to the mortar. But I would probably, if I was going to do that for any one faction, it would probably be futurist, since that's the kind of like cool thing that I would want to achieve for them, because that feels futuristic. If it's like a railgun tank that like deploys and then shoots, it's like, I have no need for your inaccurate mortar shells. I can simply fire immediately, right? And that sort of thing is pretty neat. So I feel like that's pretty cool from a thematic standpoint. But there is a logical reason why in Day of Blood you might end up having futurist tech maybe mixed in with your upstart tech, or maybe just separate. I don't know if I want to go through the hullabaloo annoyance of mixing factions so that like your tier 1 factional options are what do you call it? Are the upstart, but then the tier 2 and beyond are futurist or something like that. That just on a technical, like programmatical level, that's annoying. So I probably wouldn't do that. But you could imagine a situation where that could be kind of interesting and maybe even useful for other map makers out there, other developers. But nonetheless, the Zerg tutorial is progressing and other single-player content is happening. So just wanted to throw that out there as we get into the episode proper. We are jumping into the next section, which is about all of those improvements and fixes that we have been making. I will say that I'll bundle in an announcement about the iscript extender, which is that Veek has started to grab the necessary libraries and other supporting code that are going to help us actually load the extended iscript files. And I have started porting the remaining hooks that need to be actually hooked up. So that's a replacement or reimplementation of various things in the original game as far as functionality is concerned. And that is the work of X405, the reason why we're able to start doing that. So really appreciate X405. He's a real cool guy for going through the procedure for that. I do think that it's a pretty solid move at this point to get that done. And I'm really looking forward to inevitably getting to the point where how would I say this? I feel like it's it's a long time coming, but it's going to be really momentous when we're able to actually say that we have extended iscript. We'll be able to start developing the Askosi, which is our 4th race, and actually putting them into the game. Like months ago, I was half of mine to create like a different branch and start like cutting out iscript stuff that I didn't need just so that I can make room to develop them in a prototype area. And that would actually be really annoying to do from a standpoint of like, what would you call it? Just like logistically trying to like blend data files after the fact and all this other stuff. That would be really annoying because they're not files you can easily merge with Git or whatever. So you would have to actually manually transcribe them, the entries, like entry by entry. That would be really obnoxious. So yeah, I was definitely not feeling like, oh yeah, that's a great idea in the long term, but like the short term, I was like, God damn, I want to do this. I just want to make this happen. And so I'm really stoked to get development done on the Askosi when we can, which maybe as soon as month of June, depending on how fast this rocks. There's a high likelihood that the work that we're doing on the iscript extender will more or less be done and vetted and ready to go by the end of this month. Maybe even sooner than that sounds. Like maybe it'll be in 2 weeks or a week or something. I don't want to put an exact time frame on it. There is that classic adage where you take the estimate that you have for your time and you double it and then you double it again, and that might be enough time to get it done. Well, the iscript extender at this point I think is a lot closer than that. And I do feel like when there's steady movement on something and it's not like, oh, the guy who is, say somebody's like helping us do something and then they just leave or they stop working on stuff. Like, a good example would be like if say like we were going to work on a model replacement for a couple of units, and then like the first unit gets made by Balethal or Solstice or somebody, and then they get swamped with work and they can't do any more work. Then it's like, okay, if I was using like the first two models that they made as like, oh, well, we'll probably have the next two models made in the same time frame, but actually it's like, months and months. That's like one example, right? So as long as there's not some unforeseen consequence like that, I think it's fine to estimate a short-ish time frame here for the extender to be done. But I don't normally even... Oh my god, we got 3 live on stream. Holy shit, that scared me. You guys couldn't even hear it. So if I had been able to hold fast and not be an absolute lunatic and respond to the "that's 3" from my OBS, that would have been pretty slick. But it was the Shambler who just upgraded his tier from 9 a month to 12 a month. Thanks, Shambler. I appreciate you. For those who don't know, I have an announcement in my OBS thing that says "that's 3" in Eggman's voice whenever we get a donation. So even though I had muted it on OBS, it didn't actually mute it. I love that. Well, that totally destroyed me. But I'm not normally the kind of person to jump on the, oh, I'm going to announce that we're going to have this thing done and ready, train. I don't normally do that. So when I say that it's pretty close, it's pretty close. Just want to, if I'm saying that if I'm saying oh, maybe we'll get to that in a year, that's a bit different. But if I'm saying, yeah, we should be done with this in a week or so, I don't normally do that. So that's why one of the other reasons why I'm like, man, I really wish I wasn't eating crow with the regards to the Zerg tutorial. Because I said, oh yeah, it's probably done in a week. And it would have been, but we had other issues that I wasn't expecting. And sometimes that happens when you're using a closed source thing and even when you're using your own code. So figure it's worth pointing out in general. All right, I think besides the iscript stuff, I wanted to talk about, indeed, other improvements and fixes that have been made. I will say that, obviously, audiovisually, we've updated the Hierophant since last week, which had its initial deployment, but it was, silhouette-wise, very similar to the Dracodon, or at least, I don't think it was very similar, but it was similar enough that it might have caused some confusion. So I updated it some more. I thinned out the front legs a lot. I feel like its walk cycle should be adjusted at some point, but that's probably more Balethal's territory, or maybe even Solstice's. It was originally Balethal's rig. I've modified the mesh to try to better, deviate in some way from the silhouette, and I feel like I've done a good enough job in that. So now it's just a question of, can we denoise the visuals somehow? Because during the animation, like the player color has some noise to it. I don't know if that's like a sample rate thing. It probably is a little bit more involved than that. Maybe that's something that Solstice can help us with. And then for Balethal's sake, maybe he can go through the animation stuff. But if I had to rank order stuff that I'd like Balethal to do, one of them would be, hey, can you create an Atreus rig out of the Dracodon so that we can have a custom Atreus model that doesn't have the turret part, since that's not really within Protoss shape language. I was talking with him about potential changes to the Optecton as well, for a similar sort of idea. And if I had to rank order, the Atreus would rank higher than like adjusting the animation for the Hierophant, because the Hierophant can work right now. It's just not like, I wouldn't consider it like perfectly polished, right? That's one way to go about it. So just like the Legionnaire needs like a walk cycle adjustment because my original job wasn't so good, the Hierophant does, mostly just because when you look at it, you can pretty clearly tell that it's moving a lot faster than the Dracodon, but it still has the Dracodon's core walk cycle in terms of the animation data. It just looks very different because of the model looking different, but it's like the same skeleton under the hood and same keyframes under the hood as well. So it's animated the same way. And I think that maybe there's an argument to be made that when they're walking side by side, it could look very similar or eerie. However, I don't think that's actually a concern because the Hierophant moves so much faster. The main thing is just that it maybe looks a little floaty, or like it's there's feet sliding or whatever, because it's you usually key the animation speed and the kind of animation that you do when it comes to walk cycles to the movement speed of the unit. So, for example, if we when we made the Harakan bigger slightly and then move a little bit faster, that made his walk cycle a little bit awkward too, and we never really corrected that. So the same would be true if we took the Legionnaire and we upscaled it by 1.25, and it doesn't matter how much other stuff you change, you do need to address the walk cycle then. So that's just one example, right? But yeah, despite the fact that the Hierophant needs that walk cycle treatment and maybe some noise denoising, and also despite the fact that the Obtecton needs some denoising, some material changes, and probably a couple of other mesh odds and ends, I still feel like these changes to their models are really good, and definitely the Obtecton feels more unique and feels more like a different unit now. I will still say that the turret is a sore spot for me. I would love to make the turret more different and I'm not talking about the muzzle or like the barrel. I'm talking about the fact that it has a turret at all is a little bit weird. So Balathal and I did have some ideas for changing that in terms of its shape and its the way that it reflects on the rest of the Protoss architecture and stuff. So definitely something that is worth pointing out. Okay, we also have some more stuff to talk about, though. That's not the only stuff that we've added in the last week. I did a ton of work porting particle effects that were sent to me by Eskatumesk, and those particle effects now include reads for Vengeful Ascension, both the Avenged part and the Ascended part, and then it also includes reads for when the Herald or the Patriarch attack a unit and debuff them, making them essentially bleed shields. There's a read for that overlay. We also added 2 other reads for Terran impact effects, basically proc effects. And those are the Olympian when it's attacking a unit that's not facing it, and it thus gets more armor penetration. And then the Magnetar, which has the ability to obviously teleport units closer or pull units towards it. There's an overlay effect when that happens. And the reason why that's significant is because if the unit is burrowed or if it's a structure that's landed, those there are cases where the unit would not be able to be moved. So under such circumstances, you wouldn't want to create the overlay. And the fact that the overlay is now created on units that are moved, I think might help communicate like, oh, it just doesn't work on those other units, right? And it's also a little bit of just flash. Like the Olympian case is definitely like important for gameplay communication. The Magnetar case, you can kind of see your unit being pulled towards you. But for people who didn't know that was the Magnetar's passive, I think when they see that overlay, they'll be like, oh, that explains what's happening, right? So anyway, I figure that's important to note as well. And yeah, I think especially the fact that the Patriarch was entering into some element of like meta dominance and fast adoption, or vast adoption, right? It's like one of those things that gets used in most games that Protoss play. They build Ancestral and they go Patriarchs, at least a couple of them. So as long as the game lasts long enough for that kind of tech to hit the field, you'll generally see that unit. That puts it at a high priority list for adding more visual effects, and that's exactly what we've done now. Same is true for like the Savant, where it has that form switch stuff. That was something that we added, I think, 2 weeks ago now, or maybe it was longer than that. Again, the tournament has been going on long enough that release is very, very out of date compared to the work that has been going on pre-release. And another really important thing that we've achieved on pre-release that is related to visuals is actually a player color preference selector. You can even select let me first explain what that means. When you are in StarCraft Remastered and you're in a custom lobby, you can select what color you want to be. As far as I know, there's no controlling what color you are in 1v1 during the ranked ladder. I don't think you can control it there. But in terms of like playing BGH or something, you can pick your color, right? So if you're in a lobby, you can pick your color. That's something that people have wanted in Cosmonarchy for a very long time, particularly since we have way more colors than StarCraft Remastered. Now, here's the thing. It will be through our config file, which is a little bit annoying to use for the average user, but you can access it by launching the Fraud Launcher 2 and then clicking Configs and then clicking Cosmonarchy. And that will open up the file for you. And if you go to the bottom of the file, at least currently, that is one of the last set of options there is going to be related to the colors. So what you're going to see in those colors, or in that selection, is a list, a printout of all valid color choices. There's a lot of them. And you'll also see that you can enable something called a shuffle, basically, which means that you can list multiple entries. You can always list multiple entries, but if you enable that shuffle, it means that you will shuffle the entries, like it'll randomly select. Say you really like blue, like a particular color of blue, like Delft blue is like a color that I like a lot. And then maybe you also really like, say, Sunglow or Glacial or Magma. You can list all 4 of those and then enable the shuffle and you'll randomly get one of those. Now that's if you're using the common list. The common list basically adds those colors to all 3 races, but there are also race-specific lists, which means now that I can pick, say, I want my Terrans to be scarlet or crimson or maroon, because I really like red Terrans for some reason, and then I want, Delft blue and bedazzled blue and ultramarine as my Protoss colors, and then for Zerg, I want, say, redwood and wine and mahogany. And I can put all of those in. And then for common, say I think this color looks great on all races, so I don't mind getting it on any race. I can add, glacial and sun glow and whatever, stuff like that, right? Or like maybe one of the achromatics or something like a white, right? If the tile, if that color is available on the tile set and you are not, if it doesn't get stolen by somebody else, because it can be basically there's like it's not a host advantage, it's like a lower player ID advantage. So if I'm in spawn 0 or spawn 1, I guess for the average layman, if I'm in the first spawn, then I have first dibs on colors. So if we both put like sun glow as a color that we want, then and that's the highest in our list, and we don't have shuffle on, then I'm the one who's guaranteed to get that, and you're the one who gets your second choice. So without shuffle, it's just ranked choice order, and with shuffle, it's random. But you can imagine the stuff that you can now do. And I feel like that's just really cool. So shout out to Veek for implementing that. It's not something that I think, like the way that you pick it in terms of the UX is not great because it's a config file and it's not like a UI menu you can pick in the lobby or whatever. But the fact that you can now do per race and you can add a common stuff on top of it and you can randomize between options is actually a superior implementation than StarCraft Remastered. So it's always nice to achieve some form of feature parity with other games out there, and it's also really nice to do better than them. And I feel like even though the UX part of it is not exactly better due to the reasons I mentioned about it being a config file, the end result is inarguably more flexible and more interesting and will serve more people who are interested in that sort of thing. So you can now pick your damn color, and I hope that that's epic. That does mean, by the way, that we're going to need to come up with some way to maybe in scenario mode. Oh no, I think maybe in scenario mode it's already ignored because that would be that you set a override on the color. It'll load whatever the map setting is. So that helps. But in competitive mode and in probably all the other modes as well, it will work out just fine to allow you to randomize your color. So there you go, some more stuff that we have done. So yeah, we've talked about the iscript extension work. We've talked about the audio visuals, including new models and new reads. We talked about the player color stuff. Let's talk about banter. This is the last thing before the next section. The banter system has started to take shape. Technically, it was already started when the Eidolon would banter by saying, "You call down the thunder," or "Now reap the whirlwind" when it's painted its nuke. But Beaver gave me the idea, and really it's something that probably should have been there to begin with, that actually the Eidolon should say, "You call down the thunder" every time, and if the nuke is successful, he should say, "Now reap the whirlwind." And coincidentally, I had hooked a function recently to enable advisor lines for what do you call it? I needed custom advisor overrides for when a missile was launched, and I hooked a function that would allow me to do that. And that same function was responsible for me being able to add the banter sound from the Eidolon when he successfully nukes something. So now you'll get this pretty epic moment where your Eidolon will arrive and paint the nuke and say the line. And then if it's successful, he'll also say, "Now reap the whirlwind," and then you get nuked. So that's pretty epic, I think. So that was a recent thing. But we also achieved the banter for a specific case for the Hierophant. And this is important because, or it's important to me, because when I first came up with the Hierophant, I also wrote out a script for different banter things. When it would attack a unit and kill it when that unit had full stacks of its passive, so it was signified with malice and not just with cowardice, then it's supposed to basically say like, "The fate of all fools," and one other option is it just laughing, and another one is it screaming "coward," and that's really epic. And now that's in the game. So that'll show up in replays, that'll show up when you're witnessing, that'll show up when you're on the receiving end, and that'll also show up on the player's side when they do it if they haven't recently selected that exact Hierophant. The specifics of this system are such that it will basically grab all units that could have sent that transmission and say, if one of you sent this transmission, none of the rest of you don't need to, but let's put you on cooldown as if you had sent that transmission. And that basically prevents it from stacking up over and over again. Maybe the transmission range should actually be wider than the initial range so that it gets other units around the unit that did get picked to send the transmission. I'm not really sure exactly how it should go. There's probably like a better implementation of that. But the idea is that it stops you from hearing the same banter stuff like spammed constantly. Because if we were to add banter for every single unit, that would be a problem. And so eventually I would also like to maybe shut down unit banter at a smaller cooldown if any other unit banter has happened recently. I'm not exactly sure how I would achieve that, but I can come up with some ideas, and maybe Veek also has some ideas for that. Meanwhile, at the very least right now, the Hierophants cannot say that banter line more than, or they can't proc that banter event more than 1 minute or less than 1 minute apart from each other. So there's a 1 minute cooldown on the same Hierophants being able to say the same things. But if you fight elsewhere with other Hierophants, you can get it again. And if you fight with like Hierophants that were right next to them but weren't close enough to be ticked in that way, then you can get it again. So there should probably also be some sort of like global cooldown for banter that says like, hey, you can't hear another banter line for at least 5 seconds. You know, something simple like that, right? I don't know. Maybe it's better and more thematic if the units start shouting at each other and talking to each other. Maybe that's actually more interesting and cool and epic. And maybe there needs to be a config option to disable banter if people really find it distracting or something. I don't know. I would generally try to err on the side of, no, this is the correct way to experience the product. But I have a feeling that will be a thing that some people will not appreciate. I don't know. I think it's really cool. Try it out on pre-release if you want. Just grab some Hierophants and start attacking some enemy units. And if they stack up to 5 before they die, you'll get the line and you'll probably see what I'm talking about. Conversely, fight Protoss and with, say, Terran Bio or something, and or whatever, anything, and let them kill your 5-stack unit and let them do the thing, and then be like, oh shit, I'm terrified now, because that's exactly what's going to happen. So yeah, pretty cool stuff, and we'll continue to sand off the rough edges of it, but I'm excited to implement more banter options. For example, the Cyprian is supposed to have a cool line if he gets a multi-kill with his piercing, or maybe it's just like he fires one shot that hits like 5 targets or something. Stuff like that. We can look around. There's supposed to be banter for when the Madcap is fully charged and still shooting afterwards, or maybe takes damage after. I have to think about exactly what the event will be. There's all sorts of cool shit. So stay tuned for more banter for sure, and definitely an exciting thematic system that I think pretty much everybody can be happy about. I actually don't really, I said earlier, like maybe some people will not like it or find it distracting. I don't know if anybody can argue that it's just bad though. Like it seems like a really cool thing. The question is, should it be an optional thing, or should you be forced to deal with the fact that when your units die to a Hierophant, he laughs at you and makes you feel bad for the mistake you made? I think that's probably fine. Let's talk now about the Throneroom finals. We are going to preview the last day of play for none other than Acropolis number 1's Throneroom. And now I have pulled up the bracket on my side so you guys can see, or I can see. I guess I can show you guys what I'm up to. I can enable my browser capture and see if it works out here. So yeah, this is just the website that I've been using to visualize it. This isn't the fancy view, but you can see how the bracket played out so far for the previous phase. We had Hapsea prevailing over Newt 3-0. Some of those games were really interesting. Other ones were a bit more one-sided. We had Hamster versus AOT prevail 3-1. So AOT is now out of the tourney, but he did well to bleed Hamster at the very least. And then I didn't enter this in, but this was a 3-0 for Nebline, which was quite surprising. So that means that Shambler falls to the lower final, and he awaits the winner of Hapsea versus Hamster, which is going to be our first match. That is going to kick off at 1 p.m. Eastern time on Saturday. Following this match, I have a 2-hour period where after this match, like 2 hours later, so at 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll have the lower final. And then 2 hours after that at 5 p.m. Eastern, we'll have the grand final. Nebline will be very well rested. And then besides that, I think that might just be everything, right? Whoever ends up facing him will have played at least one best of 5, maybe 2 if it's not the Shambler. Although the Shambler has been looking pretty good, and he wants to fight back versus what Nebline showed. A very, very different style than what he was expecting when it came to that lower final. So I'm very excited about how this is all going to play out, and I think there's a pretty strong chance that Nebline cements himself as a Zerg winner. And I will say that there's been a little bit of inside baseball here where Neblime said that there's a high likelihood that if he wins this Acropolis, after winning Ascension 7 as Terran, if he wins this Acropolis as Zerg, there's a high chance he picks Protoss and tries to win with that in the second Acropolis. I'm not really sure that he can do that, because I feel like now we're starting to get better players. Like, this might be the last hurrah for the old guard, insofar as I'm sure some of them will still be there. But we've got people like Leviathan, aka Hit 'em Up, coming in, and I guess he's like a 2300 remastered random player. Like, what? That's insane. That's like S. I'm pretty sure that's S rank. I actually don't know the MMR range, but that's like a really, really high MMR for general. Like, I think that's above A at the very least. So even if it's like low S, it's still S, right? So that's pretty absurd. Then we have obviously EUD64, Eclipso, and then Top Ramen grinding it out as well, improving his understanding. So like some of the new guys and some of the very new guys are definitely worth a shout. I know Krankendao has been around for a bit, and he's been grinding out and developing crazy strats like Larvosk first into Pool as Zerg, and like apparently it's good. Like, that's crazy to me. So I'm just saying, this might be the last time we see a bracket that looks like this. That's all I'm trying to communicate to you guys. And if it does end up looking like this anyway, if it's still the top four are still Hamster, Hepsea, Shambler, Neblime, then, well, goddamn, they must have gone through some serious competition. But that is going to do it for that little shot there. I just wanted to show off the bracket a little bit and explain, like, yeah, dude, we've got some really cool stuff coming for this finals. And also, that this might be their last opportunity to nab a title, quote unquote, for free. It's not for free, but it's for easier, maybe a cheaper cost than having to duke it out against some of these absolutely absurd people that are starting to play the game. And if AOT practices more, I think he can be an even deeper threat, go way deeper than this. I think if somebody like, who am I thinking of? If Herbmon sticks around and plays some more, or Grunch decides to stick around as well, they could definitely be in the next one. The next one won't be for some time, so we have time for even more people to join and just start absolutely wrecking face. But let's focus a little bit for now anyway. Remind ourselves, reel ourselves back in and say, whoa, man, we still got to deal with this Throne Room finals. Let's get through it. And I will also mention that I think that this is going to be a very cool result. I mean, we're keyed up for 2 Protoss versus Protoss matches, but they will look way more dynamic. My prediction is anyway, they'll look much more dynamic than before, than the other matches, right? So when we have a situation like Hepsea versus Hamster, that's going to look very dynamic. If we have Shambler versus either of those, that'll look very different, right? It'll either be Hamster or Shambler, in which case, damn, that's a match that we haven't seen yet. And if it's Hepsea Shambler, that's a rematch where Shambler 3-0'd him, and Hepsea wants to 3-0 him right back. And if it's Neblime who faces any of these players, it's still going to be a banger CVP afterwards. But it's going to be way more dynamic than the other PvPs, is what I'm trying to say. Like, you can't really get the standard, like, silly mirror matches that you would sometimes get in other games. Like, I'm thinking of StarCraft 1 PvP and how coin flippy it is. It's not really like that because the information isn't as easy to deny. You can't deny scouting as easily. Even if you do, you can still build up a pretty safe opener. And I know that Hepsea has been practicing versus the gate style that Shambler likes to do in PvP, and may have some tricks up his sleeve. I also know that he's been practicing playing gates himself a lot anyway, and maybe that will serve him better versus Hamster. So he's maybe my dark horse to make it through, but I always got to say that Hamster has my vote. The guy is just like... When he switched on, he switched on. And yeah, sure, as Protoss, he hasn't necessarily had the same killer instinct that he sometimes had as Zerg. Like, he could be very aggressive as Zerg, if people don't remember from his Ascension 7 days. And he would sometimes know exactly when to push the buttons, but maybe he doesn't know exactly when to do that as Protoss. But he is improving, he is practicing, and he's the guy who makes the crazy runs happen. If he just runs straight through this again, if he 3-1s Hepsea, 3-1s the Shambler, and then, once again loses 3-4 to Neblime, then history repeats itself, and that just makes plenty of sense to me. We'll see who actually makes it in there, though. I'm very excited with the prospect of what this is all about. And yeah, pretty cool stuff. We'll jump into our second section about or after the Throne Room stuff. It's not our second section at all, but it is a pretty cool section anyway. It's about balance. But before I talk about balance, can I just mention that there's something that I forgot to mention in the latest improvements and fixes stuff, is we caught like 2 or 3 things that could have maybe resulted in desyncs, including one that was very recent, where when you are issuing a targeting order with your, say like you're trying to place a building, but you haven't left clicked to confirm the placement yet, or you're trying to cast a spell, but you haven't casted the spell yet, like you haven't left clicked, and then you select, 1 for your army hotkey, your army control group. It won't cancel that out. That was a bug from when Veek re-implemented selection that was never resolved. So that's something that's pretty big, and I just wanted to point that out because when we are able to resolve that, that means that maybe that's like a desync case where you might be issuing orders that are actually invalid to the units, but maybe they still get carried through somehow, right? There's definitely a case where there was some RNG stuff that I was improperly handling in some of the ability casting code. So that's resolved. And a bunch of other stuff has just been fixed, resolved, re-implemented, whatever. So we've fixed a lot of crashes already. We fixed, and these were all rare crashes. So it was like 1% of games maybe, but still worth fixing, obviously. And we've also investigated a lot of general issue reports and stuff. So, it's very clear to me that the future is looking bright on that front. The desyncs can be really pernicious, is in that when they happen, it just feels like, oh man, like as a player, you feel like, damn, all this effort that I went through to play this game is just out. And maybe it's like, it would be like if it was a disconnect. Say it's, instead of thinking about it as a desync, right? Think about what happens if you play a strat and then you disconnect. And or like whatever, some act of God happens and you don't even you just don't even get the connection at all. That could be something where it's like, damn, I really wanted to be able to do this. I really wanted to be able to run that strategy, but now he knows what that strategy is, and I have to redo. And sure, it's not a loss, but it might have been like now he's had time to think about how to adapt to that, right? A desync is kind of like that, in that it essentially nullifies the current result. You got to replay, and then were you relying on the element of surprise, right? That sort of thing. So I would just point that out because I feel like that's a problem, and it's definitely something that we got to fix. But it's also so hard to track down and triage and to get really good data on it. And we've tried so hard to like give ourselves really good data with the desync logging, the criticals and stuff. And they do help us, but it's like not very clear how we would go about making it happen sometimes. And what exactly is breaking and where to even go to fix it. And that is the kind of thing that can really get you down because it's this critical issue that needs to be resolved, and yet you have no immediate path to resolving it. And so from a psychological standpoint, I know it's really bad for the players. It's also really bad for me as a designer and a developer. Like it does sap at the motivation a little bit, make you feel down, like, oh man, there's just no. But then on the flip side, when you manage to make it work, when you find a thing that could have been resulting in an issue and you say, fuck it, dude, I'm going to fix that. And you do. And then the desyncs stop being reported as often. That's very gratifying too, right? That's like fills you with hope that maybe we have caught in some of them. And yeah, sure, that maybe there's some more still to catch, but that's still something. Big deal, right? It can be a big deal. So I wanted to have a brief word on that because I forgot to mention that in the previous section. And now we can talk about the balance changes. So there's some considerations for balance that are up there for me. I've obviously been listening to the community about, say, the Hydralisk, right? I feel like on par with a lot of other units, the Hydralisk can feel very like a free choice that you would always want to go for. And that does 2 things. That makes it frustrating to itemize against when you are building your composition and you're trying to fight Zerg, and they go for this thing. Then maybe you start to think, okay, do I maybe mass Gladius? Do I maybe, try to like just respond specifically to the Hydralisk throngs and the swarms that are moving across the map? And even if they incorporate other units into their comp, the Hydras are always the ones stealing the show and doing the most damage. The other ones can still be useful, but it feels very overdetermined that Hydras are really good. And I like Hydras being good. I mean, this used to be called Project Hydra, so obviously I'm a fan. But when it comes to the response, I feel like it basically narrows the decision tree for both the player who's playing as Zerg and building Hydras and the player that's fighting Hydras. And that if you're playing against Hydras and you know how powerful they are, your choice narrows into I have to defeat the Hydra. And instead of I have to defeat the overall composition, right? And that can widen a little bit once they start using frontline for their Hydras and all that stuff. But it also gets narrowed for the Zerg player because the Zerg player says, I'm going to build Hydras because they're really good and other options are not as good or maybe not perceived to be as good. And that means that I just need Hydras, effectively. And that can be very frustrating. That can be very difficult to deal with. So that's something that I have been looking at. I've thought about that basically we should try to make them more reliant on a front line by reducing their HP by 5 or their armor by 1. Maybe both, but that might be too steep. Because I don't want them to be useless, right? I want, basically, whatever change happens, I want them to be able to achieve the same level of power that they currently have if they are utilized well with other units. That's basically how I want to shift it. I want the unit to not be able to do everything on its own, or most of the, like 90% of the work that you need done on its own. I want you to be able to combine the units, because composition is supposed to be king in Cosmonarchy. And most of the time, I'd say it's closer to being king than to being a thing that you ignore. It's definitely something that you have to worry about. And when you build a bunch of units that complement each other across branches or indeed within the same branch, that tends to be the really good situation to be in. Like, that's why Goliath Cleric is really cool, because broadly speaking, you're combining mech units that are powerful for dealing damage and surviving with healing units that will help you sustain. And the healing units in this case are bio units. And so you're taking from two different branches, two different facilities. You should get a disproportionately more effective composition out of doing that than just adding more Goliaths, right? That's one example of it. So the fact that Hydras give you more Hydras is pretty much always a good choice. I think that's probably the main thing that I would want to attack, where I need the Hydra to, at a certain point, fall off if you've only made the Hydras. And I think that does happen now, but it happens later than it needs to, as like one way to describe it, right? So we could make them more reliant on a front line by reducing their durability ever so slightly. We could, adjust their other stats, but I like attack speed or movement speed or something, or even just raw damage. Although I'll come back to that because I feel like that's the least attractive option. And the other one is that we could remove armor penetration entirely so that they have no armor penetration at all. So they had 3 armor pen before, now they have 2. It could be that if they were to have 0 armor penetration and still deal 10 damage, that would still be pretty efficient. Because 10 damage is a lot of damage to be dealing every time they attack, and they attack fairly fast, and they can move fairly fast as well. So they would start to deal, say, 9 damage to other Hydras, 8 damage to Iziricors. If you're thinking about other, like, non-ZVZ meta, you think they'll deal 8 damage to Dracodons, which have 2 armor. They'll deal 7 damage to Zealots while their shields are up, or Amaranths, period. Golems as well, which have 3 armor. So, you can start to put the pieces together, only dealing 6 damage to unsieged phalanxes. Of course, they'll deal 8 damage to Goliaths. That's still a considerable amount of damage, but it might make it so that you now start to think about, how do I get some armor end in here, or how do I make some units that don't worry about armor as much? Like maybe the Zethricore, which has 2 armor penetration, would actually start to be better at dealing damage in certain situations. A question of course, can it survive? And that's maybe a separate section of like, hey, maybe the Zethricore needs some attention. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I have taken some steps to improve the attractiveness of pool units by making the pond a bit cheaper on gas. It's 75 of each resource now instead of 50 minerals, 100 gas. And the reason why I decided to do that is because I think there's already cases where you've made a lot of pool units for one reason or another, and that situationally means that the pond is more valuable to you. So then you would maybe consider going pond. Now it's less gas intensive to go pond, which means you can do that and do other things, right? So maybe I can go pond and still get my den, or maybe I can go pond and still get my shroud. And either way, it like allows you to spend a little bit less gas on that, but you can then pad that gas spending with other things. You can spend it on a couple of other details. I feel like that's important and useful. The Iziricore time cost is also reduced pretty considerably, so that might help it in contrast to the Hydralisk. But mostly thinking about that Hydra, I don't want to reduce their attack speed, their movement speed, or their damage, mostly because even though I think it would help to resolve the problem, it would feel like an irrevocable nerf. Like, you can't really ever get that damage back, you can't get that attack speed back, you can't get that movement speed back. Unless your situation, I guess movement speed is a bit different because you can situationally do that by like using a Zoristhaleth or a Cascathalor or something like that. In team games, you can use an allied vassal or whatever. There's things like that. Now, when you're talking about, generally speaking, though, like in the vast majority of cases, you can't get that back. Same for attack speed. There is no attack speed steroid for the Zerg. However, there's things that make it so that the movement speed matters a little bit less because you can maybe use ensnaring brood, and that gives your hydras the ability to slow units and then keep sticking to them. So maybe then their movement speed nerf wouldn't be that big of a deal if we went that route. But it's like very, very situational. Whereas if there's more ubiquitous armor end options for Zerg, which maybe should happen, I would be open to that idea for sure. That could be something to think about. Like I've actually been thinking recently that maybe, I don't know if ensnaring brood should do this, but maybe the Vorvikor at the very least should do this, where its attacks rend armor in addition to applying ensnare. Maybe that would be like a unique to the Vorvikor passive. Well, it wouldn't necessarily have to be unique to the Vorv. Maybe the Gitorikor does it too, or something, some other unit like that. But the Vorv might specifically do it, and it would be a unique effect relative to ensnare. It wouldn't be packaged with ensnaring brood or an ensnaring captivating claws type of deal, right? So maybe that would be something worth exploring, because then maybe Vorv start to be more useful to allow Hydras, if they lose their armor pen, to still have that damage, right? That's the thing that's like very attractive to me, is like the idea that maybe the armor matters versus Hydras more than it currently does, earlier than it currently does. That would definitely be something that would be worth taking a look at. And maybe then we wouldn't need to adjust their durability at all. Maybe it would be enough to just remove their armor pen, but add in a way for even tier 1 Zerg to rend armor so that they can at least ground armor, right, if with the Vorv. And then, we can start to think about like what else can be done in other ways. Because the Vith is there for armor end for air. Maybe the Vorv is there for armor end for ground. And then you start to think about it like, well, Bactylisks really struggle versus armor, just like the Hydra would in this world, although they wouldn't struggle as much as the Backed. Maybe then the Vorv becomes like a meta choice to pair with the Backed, right? That could be another target. So there's a lot of like potentially cool, attractive things that I'm trying to think about in my head, like how I can make it work. So definitely stuff to keep in mind. And I hope that this sort of measured approach to adjusting the balance isn't frustrating for people and they appreciate why we're doing it. We don't want to, basically in general, as like a broad philosophy, I don't want to just nerf things and not give the unit that like the race that had those things something else in exchange for it. Like, again, as long as you have a way to get back to the level of power you were at before the nerf, unless the nerf is so obviously justified because like the unit is absolutely busted in every way, or like the stats are just so far out of whack. I don't think the Hydra stats are like 50% out of whack. I think they're like maybe 20% or 15% max. And that's still a significant amount. But if you can get back to that level of DPS or that level of power or whatever it is, statistically speaking, through composition, that works for me. That's something that I like the idea of. So hopefully that all makes some sense anyway. And besides that, there's a couple of other things that I can mention. The Legionnaire has 1 time cost increase, 1 second time cost increase. Just a very minor thing that will hopefully push it in a direction where Protoss won't be spamming that as much, although the counter to it has apparently been discovered according to Hepsea. But it's still, I think, good because it like makes it less overdetermined, similar to the Hydra, but in a way that's just the time cost, right? That's I don't think the rest of the unit needs to be adjusted because its utility is, I would say, very scant in the mid game and the late game. The way that there has been a discussion about whether units in the early game fall off too much. I think if that is true, the solution to that should be adding or reshaping existing tools such that they allow you to scale your early compositions into the later stages of the game. So that would be like, again, the idea of like the Vorvikor rending armor helps the Bactylisk. Well, there would be a mechanism for something like that. Like Carapace Swarm is a great mechanism for Zethrakors to find value. And so is Broodspawn for that matter. So is the Vilgaleth, right? Because Zethrakors are cheap fodder and then they have value in creating Broodspawn. And that can turn tides in battle because they're soaking up damage and lifestealing to soak up more damage and, attacking at the same time as other stuff to add more damage dealt to your enemy and stuff like that, right? So that's all well and good. But the main thing to note about this is that may not be true for all cases. I think the Clarion paired with Zealots is really, really strong. I think, obviously, the idea of using the analog to reflect attacks would be really cool too. But how practical are those options? Maybe not very practical due to the costs associated with acquiring those units. Maybe not very practical because those units might be underpowered in their current form. There are a couple of options there that feel like something that should be thought about. So if, it seems to be a narrative right now that Hapsea and other Protosses have been mentioning, that it feels like Zealots are not very powerful until the late game. But I've also seen other Protosses say that Zealots are really strong, and I've seen a lot of other race players say that Zealots scare them even in the mid to late game. So I'm not getting uniform opinions on the matter, and I'm also not really seeing people attempt to build Mass Zealot, for example, in the late game. So that's like one specific unit example that maybe falls off really hard in the late game, or maybe doesn't, and we just need more data on it. But that, I like to at least indicate that I'm metabolizing the reports from people and trying to understand how accurate they are to an actual understanding of the game, or a practical, here's the data where this happens or whatever. So these hypotheses sometimes are stated as if they were fact when they are not, which is just the way that some people talk, and that's fine, I guess. But obviously it's something that can also be thought of in the future. And another thing that affects Protoss, by the way, is the Monument of Sin being bigger, the Lattice being bigger. Of course, this pairs with our changes to the Grand Library and the Ancestral Archives, which are also smaller and bigger, respectively, right? The Grand Library being smaller by 1 tile of width, and the Ancestral Archives being much bigger than it was before, using the old Grand Library graphic and size. So there you go. Of course, just like I said in the latest installment of the Cosmonauts Compass, which is linked below in the description, there's some nice screenshots and goodies in there if you guys want to see what's been cooking. Definitely a lot to mull over and think about, but there's a lot of ideas, a lot of things to consider. We want to keep making this game really good and really cool. Balance is a part of that, although I don't think it's as much of a part of that as maximizing the fun part first and then thinking about balance a little bit later. But we are running tournaments, so it would be nice if the game wasn't really imba in favor of one race or another. And some people will say that the current crop of players, where there's no Terrans in the top 4 and 3 Protosses out of 4 in the top 4, maybe that indicates race imba. But I think our sample size is a bit too low to draw exact conclusions about stuff like that. So let's move on to the community roundup. We are here to talk about the community that is growing. Cosmonarchy cannot be stopped. So I always like to start off the community roundup by giving a shout out to some of our new members that have already been active in the community since their arrival. And I always go based on the last week, of course. So I do see a number of people who have been in some of the stream chats and stuff, like I believe Catan was there, and maybe F as well, although I actually can't remember where I've seen that guy's username before. But they've popped in exactly 7 days ago. We had a couple other people, Apollo Apostolos, who sent me a very nice, heartwarming message and has been checking out a lot related to the project. Maybe he even listens to these podcasts. I'm not sure, but shout out to you, dude. You know who you are. We also had Goodman, who is a Russian guy that does not speak English and apparently really likes mephedrone. So he didn't really do too much as far as the community is concerned, but he gave himself the Fraud Monarch role and then was very confused when people were pinging him for games. So shout out to that guy. We had Comical Flop join. He's been in my Twitch chat a little bit. He had described the game as something that he was hoping to share with his friends because they said that Brood War was too hard, but he didn't want to play StarCraft 2 with them anymore, so he recommended this. Hey, you know what? Whatever angle you can take to get more people in the door, I probably don't mind. Twins and Odyssey was in here asking about matchmaking. Unfortunately not yet, but eventually, sir. Eventually. And we had a couple other people pop in who have been pretty active, actually. I mentioned earlier Hit 'em Up, aka Leviathan. I actually don't know what his primary username is now. He hasn't streamed in a while, but I remember seeing him as a StarCraft streamer way back. So he's pretty cool, and he's been gaming a lot. He's doing a lot of games here, playing, I guess, way more than he played Stormgate's beta, so fuck your angels. And then we had Arcadia, pop in, who's been apparently sharing around the project with friends and trying to get them set up and stuff. They had a recent run-in with the debug issue. So we have this weird issue where the first time you run the game, it assumes that debug is the best mode to run in, and that is due to some fallacious assumptions from Blizzard that are no longer true about our work that we have to then hook and correct. So that's actually on my radar to work on later today or maybe tomorrow. But by the time you're listening to this, maybe it's fixed. Just a check in. We'll see how it goes. We had Emperor Mengsk join. Dude, who? But he's got the StarCraft 2 portrait, so he's been playing some of the single player stuff. He sent it a bug report, which is helpful. So hopefully we can get all that stuff wrangled. And shout out to I think that's everybody. I know Smarty invited one of his dogs in, one of his friends, and so I don't know what the deal is with that, but I appreciate them joining and spreading the word. More people you can bring in, of course, probably the better, as long as they're not total lunatics. And even if they are, maybe we can make them better. Maybe we can fix them, guys. I can fix her. All right, that's it for the sort of roundup as far as the new people are concerned. We had more people than that join, but I haven't seen them. A couple of people join just to message me stuff sometimes. I don't know how active they'll be in the community as a result of that, but that is that for now. Let's turn our attention to some of the maps that are coming out. So this is a 1 versus 1 desert map. We saw it earlier, actually. Last week, it's by the Beaver 99, but it has been an initial attempt at detailing has been done. I say attempt because he's had to use sand dune tiles instead of sandy sunken pit tiles, and he's had to use these ramps here for north-facing ramps, these sort of amalgamations. So I am going to make the tiles that he needs, including trying to take this and turn it into an actual ramp. That'll be my first project, since that's the most important. And following that, I'll see if I can make, sunken pit variants of the crevices, which will be easy, and the doodads, which will be maybe a bit more involved. But he's helpfully used all of the sand dunes doodads, so it will encourage me to make all of them work. But besides that, it's the map that has the anchors in the middle that are guarding the high ground up here. And it also has some side passageways, which are pretty interesting. I feel like this map will be pretty neat to see games on. And it's not too, I would say, how would you describe it? I don't think it's like too one note exactly. It has been improved visually a little bit. I do think we probably could see a couple of extra tiles. Maybe I can add some if the Beaver thinks any will be helpful and appreciated. But always cool to see another map by this guy. He's got some cool instincts for maps, and he's made some really interesting ones in the past. I don't see any reason why it won't be like that this time around. And other than that, the other map that is upcoming is by BiddyB. We showed off the original attempted remake layout of Paradiso, or no, it's Dante's Peak, but he's called it Paradiso, which is pretty cool. And I don't know if he's changed the name to Paradise or not, but that's the name of the file. And it's a 4-spawn map, rotationally symmetric. He's rebuilt the layout using XY symmetry on the left and then on the right to create a RotSim map. And it's pretty cool. I was just telling him how there could be some improvements/adjustments to the 3 and 6 bases to add a little bit more gameplay to the left and right hills, which are further away from the middle of the map. The left and right ones actually can maybe snipe units coming over here. And so widening the bridges would be pretty nice, which is already something he's planning on doing. Whereas these, going up here, besides the fact that you can kind of build like a sentinel up here or whatever, besides that, you can't really affect change down here. I guess you could land units up here, which maybe is a concern for the hyper late game. But I feel like if you're doing that already, you're using transports. I don't think we have to legislate against that exactly. So my recommendation was to take this bridge here and extend it to the left, this one extend to the right, this one to the right, and this one to the left. And that would be a rotationally symmetric way to extend all the bridges and make it so that you have slightly wider pathways for big armies to go through. And then maybe these ramps should be moved ever so slightly closer to the borders. But besides that, I feel like the hills are really cool. Definitely an iconic aspect of, the original being called Dante's Peaks, or Dante's Peak singular, maybe. I can't remember. Just cool stuff. And I feel like this is a good start anyway, so we'll see how it shapes up. But we could very well be playing on this in the Royal Invitational, which is a tournament that I'll probably talk about more after Throneroom is over, right? So after Acropolis #1 concludes, so the next podcast episode, remind me to talk about that. And that brings us to the coffee questions. Boys, boys, boys. If you like what we're doing here and you have some money to spare and you want to send it to us so that we can make even more cool decisions about the game, even more great progress made, improving it, and make even more content, then you know where to go. It's our coffee page. And obviously we've retooled the tiers for that, as mentioned at the intro. We've definitely done a lot of work to try to make those feel like you're getting something for your value. Some people will donate and not really turn in their, like there's a lot of people who've donated and never asked a question. And to those people, we say thank you for your support. Clearly you feel like you're getting enough as it is, that you don't really need to worry about that. And so I appreciate that. And then besides that, of course, there's people who donate, and some people donate exclusively like on a one-off basis, but they do it like pretty regularly. I understand the appeal of that solution because it's like, oh, when I have money and I can donate it, then I can go ahead and do that. However, we're going to be moving away from that, giving you access to the perks, because it's a weird administrative task that we don't really have the time for to convert the amount donated into like, how many months of that does that give you, right? And then we would also have to ask like, okay, you're buying how many months of this tier? Anyway, it's just a little confusing. So we appreciate one-off donations as well, but they will pretty soon, I think in the next month or so, we'll start phasing out the access for the perk of say like Q3A, which is our Q&A idea. It just has 3 in it. For example, we'll start phasing out access for that stuff and pinging people with that role only for access to the threads for the questions, for example. And we do have questions this time around. So I figured I'd just make that quick announcement here. The people already know about that, but it's one of the reasons why we redid the tools for the tiers. We wanted to give the tiers something where that you are getting value for your purchase in addition to supporting our work. So if you just want to ask questions and you want to talk smack to us, then you can donate at the Q3A tier. If you donate 12 or more, you get access to the secret Smash streams, and you'll also be given access to the products that we're building for in those Smash streams when they are ready for being tested. You'll get dibs on that. And by tested, I don't mean like, hey, I haven't done any testing at all. Why don't you test this for me? That's a waste of both of our times, because you'll say there's a bug right when it starts, and maybe you won't describe the bug super well, and then I'll be like, what do you mean? So it'll just waste everybody's time. I will do my own initial testing. Maybe I'll have Vic do it if he's able to as well. And then after that, and we've verified that everything's good, I'll go ahead and release it to the people at that tier. And of course, the project contributors as well, like DF and stuff, if they're interested in giving it a run. But after that, there's a couple of other tiers that we have. So, definitely feel free to check the coffee link out. I guess I'll update the coffee link for this one time to indicate that the tiers have been updated. Like I'll specifically link to the tiers sublink, if you will. But a brief rundown of the other options are 33 per month. That gives you access to when we're doing our monthly donator discussion, you'll be able to speak during that as opposed to simply typing. So you'll have the Speaker of the Frauds perk. Everybody else can type, even the Q3A tier can type. So that's not that nobody's at that tier yet, but that's the way to basically control it so that it doesn't get too out of hand in terms of people speaking. Because if I'm speaking and Vic's speaking and other project contributors are speaking and everybody at the Q3A tier is speaking, you would never be able to go anywhere with that. The joke tier at $69 per month gives you access to a monthly content request, which could be a map or level in the game. It could be a video, stuff like that. And of course, it includes all the previous tier rewards. And then the mother of all ones is the Threeborn Man Crow at $333 per month, $333. That is a sponsored shout out basically in the tournaments, and you can give us a logo and stuff as well. We basically think of that as kind of like a sponsorship. So we'll shout you out. Maybe in the daily videos and stuff, we would also be shouting you out at that point, having your logos sort of flashing around during those daily videos as like a sponsored by, and then it fades around and stuff. I think that stuff like that is pretty cool. I don't think anybody's going to get to that anytime soon, but that would be one such thing at that tier, and that wouldn't be sent to tournament prize pools. That would be sent to our development, just to be clear. We would just also show it on the tournaments. So there you go, a little bit of info on that. All right, enough info on the coffee stuff. Let's actually get to the perks that these people are paying for. Myrian is our first person to ask a question. He says, or asks, how do you go about designing new units for your various projects? So new units out of sort of the ether it's a little bit different depending on what you're talking about, right? So I will use the Askosi as an example because they are the fourth race of Cosmonarchy. They will be being added to in a game that already has existing unit concepts and mechanics and systems already done. I find that that's actually the best world to design units in because you already have these certain assumptions that you can take. And then you basically have built the frame that you can then paint in, but you also know when you're painting outside of that frame or when you want to kind of cheat and be like, hey, I'm going to go around that frame or like extend that frame to the right or something for the purpose of like adding a little bit more or, doing something a little bit differently. So when it's more vague and you don't actually know what your frame is looking like yet, then you have to be kind of, I won't say bare bones, but you have to take that into account when you're designing units. So when we were designing units for Pangea and for Onatar, I had some idea of what the gameplay would be like, but otherwise I was just kind of envisioning a default of StarCraft 1 style gameplay in terms of, regardless of whether or not things like the auto rally thing, the auto harvest on rally works, or the multi-building select and stuff like that. We would assume certain details like, this does and this doesn't happen. But in terms of the actual controlling a unit thing, that's a lot more satisfying in StarCraft 1 than it is in StarCraft 2. Therefore, we're going to assume that there's like basic things that are like that. Then we talk about, okay, what kind of unit does this race need? And that way there's like similarities between the Pangea work and the Onatar work and the Askosi for Cosmonarchy, because I am building from the ground up an entire race as opposed to modifying an existing race, which was the process used for Terran, Protoss, and Zerg over a very heavy amount of time. With the exception of the Pr0totype, which is our renamed Scourge, there's not a unit that exists in the game that doesn't exist in the original game that doesn't exist in Cosmonarchy. I guess maybe you could make a point and say the Spider Mine, but I would imagine that the Lobotomy Mine is a revamped version of that, right? So that's one thing to think about, I guess. But generally speaking, right, unless I'm forgetting I guess there's the ComSat and there's some tech structures, but leaving out the structures in terms of the actual units, that's stuff that there's not a unit that has just been flat out removed aside from the Pr0totype, which may well reappear in a future campaign or in a future faction thing or something like that, right? So it could show up again in the future, even if it's not in its original incarnation. So I feel like, in general, you can very easily make the argument that we haven't designed a race from the ground up yet. But even when you're designing the Askosi from the ground up, you're still doing so with the frame already established, and you can at least use that as your framework and then build around that if you need to increase the scaffolding by doing something completely different, right? You have a frame of reference, at the very least, that you can compare to. So with that as the backdrop of the game's frame of reference, and me knowing the general thematics and intended gameplay style of the race that I'm designing for, those two are very important, I would say, ingredients in the recipe. And then from there, it's just my creativity and my trying to explore some of those thematics that we have through the unit concepts, thinking about what will reinforce the gameplay ideas that I want and what will be unique relative to the rest of the field, and also how will this play against the rest of the field to some degree is another thing. So that's where the Askosi is different, because there's a lot of comparing to the rest of the field. Whereas there are going to be at tier 1 anyway, for like say Pangea or Onatar, these other games that we're building, the initial construction doesn't necessarily take into account what the other races have. At tier 1, at least for the very basic units. The very basic units are kind of like conceptual islands that are like, okay, we're going to use, or maybe island is the wrong word, but that's the building block. It's like whatever your marine equivalent is, right? It's like, okay, the proselyte for the Askosi is a building block. It's like this unit can jump to other units. That's its like key difference compared to other basic infantry or first unit that you make or whatever. And you look at the Cardinal by comparison, and the Cardinal is like a unit that favors being surrounded by allies. And so the Proselyte can immediately create gameplay by jumping to a Cardinal to benefit from a heal where maybe previously it wasn't benefiting from it, and it might have been being focused down and being about to die or something. You can imagine the hype things that you can do with that. So, jumping towards your front line. That's a novel gameplay thing. You don't really do that too often with backline or mid-range units. So that will be an Askosi thing. And that's something that they do. And then the Cardinal is like, a unit that it's like a sort of like the Throneroom, where it is supposed to be able to every second attack it's supposed to heal. The Throneroom just heals every attack, but instead of healing itself, like the Throneroom does, the Cardinal heals all allies. So that would include the Cardinal. But it would also, it's like an AoE heal that's on an on-hit effect. So it's kind of like it's a melee unit, right? So it's kind of like maybe if the Ecclesiast was melee and healed health instead of shields, that's kind of what the Cardinal is like. But that is still very unique at the end of the day, because the heal proc for the shields from the Ecclesiast is something that increases your shield regen immediately. Like it kickstarts the flash shielding regen as well. So it usually gives you more than just the flat healing, and that's very important. But besides that, there's also the consideration of, well, the Cardinal's also a melee unit, so the Ecclesiast doesn't have the same gameplay pattern that you use for that. So even though we're maybe echoing a design elsewhere in the game, we're also we have enough different about each individual unit and the use case, and also the building block that it's on top of. The Cardinal provides unique gameplay to the Proselyte that is very different, right? So I've built these things up to allow them to sort of carve their own niche or their own identity relative to the rest of the races. And that would be something that I would have to do over many passes in something like Pangea, where I've built out all of the races in terms of their tier 1 stuff. Like I have at least some idea. In some cases, I have full concept for like the chauvinists have their like all of their tier 1 stuff already conceptualized. And I know that, for example, they have this thing where they can garrison in one infantry unit in this sidecar type vehicle. And that infantry unit, basically it acts as like a mobile garrison. So it can shoot like inside an anchor, but it will be instead inside this garrison. And maybe it'll be targetable separately, maybe not, I'm not sure yet. But that immediately starts to pair with other units that have the cost size, like the transport space cost of only 1, and therefore you can put those units in the structure, or in the sidecar type thing. So when you pair that with like a melee unit, and maybe it doesn't do that much, or maybe it's really good at like, dealing with killing units that are attacking the vehicle in melee. That could be potentially helpful. Maybe if it's a high range unit, that can be really helpful. But that might be something where it's like expensive, so it's risky. And maybe if it's a mid-range unit, then that's like the more standard option for you. And anyway, that's good for building block stuff, but I don't yet know how it's going to play relative to the other options. Is it going to be too dominant? Is it not going to be very useful at the end of the day because it requires too much micro relative to what the other guys have to do to counter it? What are the circumstances in which the gameplay pattern emerges? That's the kind of stuff that I've come up with the idea that I can just by doing the design work, but then I need to test and see how it feels to play. And even once I'm satisfied with how it feels for that race, or for that regency, or for that unit combination, that composition, mechanistically speaking, as long as that's good, then we can proceed. But I still need to know, how does it play versus the other races and what the other guys can do. And that's where it's going to be really easy to do with the Askosi by comparison, because I can just play against completed races. But I can't do that in Pangea yet. So that's like a constant back and forth of like, okay, at what point am I satisfied with how tier 1 interacts with the other races tier 1? And at what point am I like the other thing you would think of is, when are you satisfied in a mirror matchup? Because that's an easy thing to do. You test in a mirror matchup and you say, okay, the tier 1 feels pretty good in the mirror. Like all of the units work properly and they don't feel like I have no choice but to mask the same unit that my enemy is building and stuff like that. That's like a really good initial point. And then you start to think, okay, now let's do the same thing with the other races mirror, and now let's test the two races against each other, and like, are there any obvious things that need to be adjusted? And then there might be some cases where it's like, well, this particular race can get very powerful off of tier 1, but the other race should then just go to tier 2. And maybe then at that point you already have some tier 2 implementation stuff done, but it's not fully implemented. And so rather than saying, I need to fix that this race can get powerful at tier 1, you just think, okay, we need to test when tier 2 is operational and see if that's still a concern, or if that's actually just totally taken care of when tier 2 is in play, because then the other race just goes tier 2 and the other guy's massing the tier 1 stuff, right? That would be like one example. So hopefully that answered the question enough, but designing new units is definitely an involved procedure, and I will be doing a lot more of it on public streams when I am working on the Askosi after our iscript extension is done. So I guess stay tuned for that in the month of June at the latest, we hope. We'll move on to answering Lucifirius' question. He asks, if you could get 3 celebrities to voice act characters in the new game, who would you get for which roles? Well, taking to Pangea, the first thing that I immediately thought of is that I would absolutely love to have Jordan Peterson voice act the advisor for the chauvinists, because the chauvinists is like a code name that's not their actual name, but there's 3 races that we plan in Pangea, and one of them is this sort of like these guys who have embraced the good parts of the Enlightenment and the ideals of individual sovereignty and stuff like that, but they also recognize that you have to be able to collaborate in order to get anywhere. And I would just love to imagine that, like, when you're under attack, you have Jordan Peterson shouting, "You've got to clean your room," or something like that. I don't know. So that's just always been stuck in my head. But like, we probably wouldn't be able to get away with that exact line, since, you know, that's not real. I don't even know what kind of game you'd have to make for that to be the case. But that would be pretty funny, I guess. But it would also be like pop culture reference. You know, it's not necessarily the most advisable task. Celebrity voice acting is always interesting, though. I just feel like that would be a good voice. He would have a good voice for the advisor and like maybe the tutorial man or something. Because so far, if you guys haven't noticed, there's been a trend where in the Protoss and Zerg tutorials, the advisor that you have there is the same as a character in the missions. So that's like something that would probably happen, is that he would be the advisor character that would get you up to speed on the boot camp. And then he would also be the guy who says, you know, you're under attack, you know, stuff, however he would mention it. So I feel like that's pretty cool. That would be a good option. Trying to think about other celebrities we would want to put in. I mean, if I can just get any celebrities, and that's not a problem, then I do think that Joe Rogan would also make a pretty good chauvinist character or something like that. Maybe he would be like your AI ally in like the campaign and stuff, and he would also then have an advisor. Like, you could select him as an advisor option, and that would be pretty good. I think that would be pretty legit. That could be funny. I'm trying to think about who else I would make, because like, we're not making these characters be themselves. The celebrities are just like, they are playing a character, but I'm not asking them to change their voice at all. Like, it's their voice, but it's not like, it's like Joe Rogan is a character in the chauvinists. Like, he wouldn't literally be called Joe Rogan, but like, I don't know exactly how to describe this. It's not that they're acting as themselves, because they themselves are not characters in the setting, but it's like their whole personality and voice would be exactly the same. I would not ask them to change anything else. I would write a script with them, for them and with them, and then say like, okay, here's the context. Like, what might you say differently than this, or does this sound good? And that would basically be it. The collaboration would be hilarious, I'm sure, because I'd be asking them to, you know, say some very strange things. Pangea is just a very strange world, so you'd get a lot of like bizarre commentary on the environment and stuff. Except maybe you wouldn't, because the denizens of that universe have been there forever, or not ever, but for a while. And so it's like, oh shit, yeah, we should just be used to this kind of wacky environment that's partially edible or whatever in this area. And no, Lucifirius, I didn't say edibles. I said partially edible. That's different. Anyway, who else would I get? Who would be number 3? I said Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan. Obviously, it should be like a third J for 3, but I can't think of any other J guys that I actually like. I'm sure there's some out there that I'm just not remembering. Oh, obviously, Jonathan Blow. Dude, duh. That's the third J, and also the third celebrity. I don't even know who he would act as. He might be like the disenfranchised sort of guru / sage character that you have to secure the allegiance of in a faraway land, and he's also playing as your faction. Or maybe he's like, maybe he's playing as he's originally from your faction, but he's controlling a different race because he's like been able to politically like backstab / sabotage a bunch of things and like cynically achieve a certain level of power in like a negative, like from an otherwise negative sort of nation. And he's like, he's commanding them, but like, he's not like waging war on you per se. He's given up maybe he's given up some element of hope, and it's like part of your responsibility is to get his character and bring him back to hope, you know? And I know his character would not be called the Witness, but that's a good idea. So yeah, there you go. Those are the 3 celebrities I would want to put forth as options. And there you have it. Thanks for your question, dude. 3Crow asks, can you discuss what the early, mid, and late game for the Omindris would be like? Bonus points if you discuss what late game Omindris tech would be like. Oh boy. So the Omindris, I was always... They were kind of my sleeper favorite pick in the Xibalba Regencies. There's 20 of these things, and they all have very different designs at the end of the day. But the Omindris are like... It's a bizarre combo. So there's these... onyx, serpentine, sort of earthy, metally sort of snakes, you can call them, I guess. They're like these giant metal serpents, almost like maybe kind of similar to like the Chinese dragons in some of their design, in that they're very long and very, very snake-like. And a lot of them don't have any limbs or anything like that. In fact, I haven't decided if any of them are going to have limbs. But the primary ones of these are called the Omindiroa, and these ones are essentially the town centers, you can think of them as. So they deploy by literally like, tunneling into the terrain from space or from orbit or whatever. You can imagine the ridiculous kind of visual that you would have in like a full motion cinematic or whatever, something like that, where they screaming through space, crashing into the ground, and almost like an asteroid impact on a very small scale in terms of how powerful that kind of thing would be, and embedding themselves into the planet. And from there, the Omindiroa is the structure that produces other structures. So they have structure-based construction. So it's pretty cool. And there's the idea that I had was that the more Omindiroa you have, the more structures, or the faster you can construct the individual structures. So like multiple of them can help with one construction attempt. Sort of like how the Askosi have team building, but with their workers. So this would be team building with structures. Very strange. Probably wouldn't show up in the early game too much. But while the Omindiroa is channeling its construction, I wasn't sure if you should be allowed to also channel or train units at the same time. Like basically, should you be able to train workers when you're also building structures? And if the answer to that is no, then probably the Omindiroa will be a bit easier to make more of in the early stages of the game, so that you can have some that are basically like your workers are your harvesters, but the Omindiroa are your builders. And so if you need to build both harvesters and builders, then you have to make a choice after a certain point, right? And so that could be kind of interesting. Like maybe the workers, the harvesters are a little bit cheaper on time cost. Maybe so that would be like one change to that. And then maybe the town centers themselves maybe those aren't the only kind of Omindiroa you can make. Maybe that's like the most flexible Omindiroa, but there might be one that's like specialized in just constructing and doesn't doesn't train workers. Or maybe it could be something like all of their production structures can train units or help in construction. So when you build like a barracks equivalent or a factory equivalent for the Omindris, or maybe that would only be some kinds of them, because that's another point, is that the Omindris are not just the Omindir, which are the serpentine sort of metal and earth snake creatures. They are currently dominated by / in servitude to the Deridris, which are these sort of mystical type creatures. They're totally sightless. They have no vision. Their eyes have not been functioning in quite a long time. And yet they still will sometimes maintain vehicles and weapons of war. And so, like, all of the Omindir basically, or the Omindris efforts or the construction that they have is like their branches wouldn't be like one branch is the Diridris and one branch is the Omindir. And so you have like the infantry that are the Diridris and the vehicles that are the Omindir or whatever. It's more like there are some vehicles that were built by the Diridris that are going to be in the vehicle branch, if you want to call it that. They're also going to have some airships and spacecraft that were built and maintained by the Diridris. And then there's also going to be many Omindir airborne units and vehicular units. I'm not sure if there will be any Omindir infantry type units, but like that hasn't been decided yet. I'm leaning towards no, but obviously since they have a monopoly when it comes to the construction attempts, that's a pretty big deal. Something that hasn't really been ascertained as to why it happens in the universe is that the Omindir they're clearly fueled and they're metal spawn, right? So these things are like, they're made out of metal that when they decay or they're destroyed, they basically turn into this sort of like liquefied agent that was holding them together previously, and maybe giving them animus as well, giving them animation. Now, that's one thing, but for some reason, somehow, the Diridris themselves also liquefy. And I was thinking that the way that when they die, they liquefy not into a scavenging thing that maybe the Omindir can sort of reassemble fallen Omindir with certain specialist units. Maybe the Diridris specifically, Diridris units can reassemble fallen Omindir. But when the Diridris fall, I wanted a different feeling there. I wanted a different mechanism. So I was thinking that when the Diridris fall, they give short-term buffs to Omindir units, or maybe all units, including Diridris units. And when the Omindir fall, certain Diridris can consume their liquefied pool bodies, the stains of the Omindir, for either reconstituting the Omindir on the field or maybe getting different benefits than what the Diridris provide, or something like that. Like maybe it's like when the Diridris decays and liquefies, it provides like a movement speed boost to nearby units, similar to like our Vengeful Ascension mechanic for Protoss. But you could imagine that the Omindir themselves, when they are consumed by a Diridris, the Diridris gets stronger. So it's like I'm buffing one unit versus I'm buffing many. And that's like the mechanism. So the Omindir are like empowering individual Diridris combatants, whereas the Diridris are empowering all combatants. That could be maybe one way to think about it. I still think the idea of reassembling them on the field is kind of neat, but it might overlap too much with like Rosellium, which we talked about in the last episode, actually. So, there's stuff like that. So the early stages of the game would be deciding how often to make workers and how often to build construction. When you are doing construction efforts, I really like the idea of all of the Omindris production structures, because I don't think there would be a distinction. I don't think there would be any buildings that are maintained, like designed and maintained only by the Diridris. Although it's possible, similar to their vehicles and their spacecraft that haven't been replaced by Omindir designs, it's possible that that maybe some of their buildings are also like that. But if the Omindir are creating all of the structures, then that kind of paves the mechanism or implies the mechanism by which the Diridris are liquefying, as just like the Omindir do. So I feel like that's probably a little bit more correct in terms of lore. But I can always write ways around any problems like that with their design. So I would imagine that the Diridris structures are not really a thing, and it's all Omindir structures, but we'll refer to them as Omindris structures because that's the whole regency, right? It's both Omindir and Diridris. So the Omindir, with their designs of their various structures and their various vehicles or vehicular, I don't even know if you call the main ones vehicles, but the ground units and the air units that are Omindir, I think that a lot of their production would be like, maybe there would be one that's like dedicated to the infantry Diridris stuff, and then there would probably be another one that is dedicated to the vehicular stuff, but including maybe a couple of air units. So I think you'd only have 2 factories in the early game, 2 factory types, instead of the 3 that maybe we're accustomed to in Cosmo. So that would be one thing that maybe will be different, or maybe that's actually maybe that will end up being the general approach for the future games in general. The reason I say that is because maybe you'll, instead of having like the conventional tech progression of like, I build an atlas and I unlock all of tier 2, we've been moving Cosmonarchy in the direction of being able to acquire chunks of the tree at once, smaller and smaller chunks, to the point where basically, in some cases, like with the Zerg, there's some instances of it being like, slightly, again, it's more linear than the Protoss, which is very free form. So it still has structure to it, but it's a little bit more, you can basically grab hold of it in a regional location for like the Terrans, its add-ons. And then for Zerg, it's not really like that. But I've said before that I think Zerg, it would be really cool if like their tech nodes had to be linked by Kagra in order to link the production, allow the production locally. So you'd build a den in your main, and that would empower all of the production in one spot. But if you wanted to add production somewhere else, you need to build another den there, right? And so that could be really cool. And then suddenly you have to worry about SimCity as Zerg again, a little bit more than you currently do. But that's a little bit involved, and we're not going to make some significant change like that now. But that was like an idea that I had. And so stuff like that would basically be more common. So you would have... you wouldn't have as many global acquisitions like the Atlas, but you would be able to step through the tech tree at more, I guess like more agilely, like in a more agile sense, but you would not be able to grab as much of it at once. So, and it would be maybe geolocated in some way. So rather than building one tech structure to globally unlock a bunch of things, you would build an add-on or a server structure that provides the plans to nearby things or is connected in some way, right? Stuff like that, right? So that would naturally lend you towards less initial factory counts because you would just have less initial assets to be able to deploy immediately, but it would be easier to expand the number of assets you have insofar as like, I don't have to wait to build a captaincy until I have an Atlas. I can build a captaincy maybe after I build a stockade in this area or something. I don't know. There's like a couple of ideas there. You can imagine how you might employ that. So back to the Omindir and their ridiculous construction methods where they basically like, I think I even described it as vomiting forth the new age. Yeah, vomit forth the metal spawn that will become the next age. That's the Omindiron. The Omindiroa are the giant tunneling through space sort of serpentine metal spawn, and the Omindiron are the basically the backbone of the Omindris operations, according to the website, right? They are the structures that build other structures. So you could imagine that they do both structure construction and unit training, but have to choose which to do. And so at some point you have to cut workers to make your first production structure. So you'd want to make sure that that feels good and doesn't feel like, oh, this is really bad. But you can also choose like how late to do it. And maybe their workers can be a bit more self-sufficient versus harassment to like allow for this. That would be like another thing to think about. So you can choose when to start deploying your first production facility. And maybe your first production, like the infantry production facility is like kind of cheap so that you can afford to do that really early on. And also it adds a little bit of value to building a lot of production early because it means that you might build an infantry production just to use that to make vehicle production or defenses or something instead of, and then you can continue to make workers. That could be a pretty interesting option there. I haven't decided yet, but I'm interested in exploring the idea that you have to build structures in a radius around your initial structure to the point where you would have to expand your structure territory closer and closer to a location in order to expand to your natural, say. But maybe there could be another method of doing this would be like having a particular structure, say like you can maybe create an Omindiroa, even a smaller scale one than what is normally their like space ferries or their like capital ships or whatever, the equivalent. And that Omindiroa could then deploy into an Omindiron at some dedicated point. Or you could call one down or something with like some specialized unit. And the reason why I'm thinking about that is like, okay, then you can expand without needing to be within initial distance of it, right? Like you can then take islands and stuff like that, right? Instead of not being allowed to. So that would probably be the primary way of expanding, but maybe you could imagine like an early game build that creeps its production structures closer to its ramp and then eventually down the ramp and into the natural, in order to skip out on needing to build the Omindiroa, unless that ends up being the only way to expand. But that would be one thing to think about, is maybe you could also expand regionally if you had enough of a range and enough structures nearby or whatever. But it also means that in order to help construct something, which maybe would automatically happen if you build it within an area that multiple Omindirons are in, you might need to then do it within their radius. So SimCity would matter a lot in the early game and especially in the mid game, but I think that could be really interesting. Maybe the Omindiroa might be able to deploy into any production structure that you want it to, which would be pretty interesting if you wanted to proxy something as well. I wouldn't want to remove the capacity for stuff like that. And since the Omindiroa would likely start out as a ground unit, but then there would be like a higher tier one that would be an air unit, you could imagine being able to basically build like 3 or 4 of those and then deploy them at a certain location. I don't know. That could be kind of interesting. Maybe like the most basic form is actually one of your workers. Like maybe your basic or even advanced worker deploys into a production facility, so that in that way it seems similar to that, but you're doing so at the cost of your worker, for the sake of like, okay, I consume my worker to do that, or I can just not train a worker and build it that way. So there's a bunch of different ways it could go. But I think it would probably be a little bit more interesting if, you choose to, between the, like, instead of choosing between consuming workers and cutting workers, you just always have to cut the worker at some point, but it doesn't last for very long. I don't know. There's stuff like that could be kind of interesting. I'll think about that a little bit more. But broadly speaking, the forces that you would create with the early game would probably involve a lot of the Diridris, as far as the early infantry goes, sort of like the young blood among them, that are... I'm not sure if I would... it's a little bit like up in the air as to whether or not they would have really low vision range, or if they have other ways of effectively being able to see things, like combat sense or something might be one thing that they have, but they are not very good scouting units. Like maybe they have pretty low vision range, similar to like a Zethrakor in Cosmo, but they have they can project out and sense movement farther or something like that. That was something that I was thinking about. Because I don't want to make them completely useless as scouting units or early units, but being able to maybe see... there's definitely a unit that the Omindris will have that is going to be able to sense like tracks or like recent movement. I don't know how we're going to program that, but being able to say that like, hey, this tile had a unit in it recently, will basically be like a feature that the Diridris, one of the Diridris units is going to be able to have. For the Omindir in the early stages of the game, you'd definitely be seeing... some pretty heavy melee tanks in the early stages. They wouldn't be very long at this stage, but that would be one thing. There's very early on, I would want the Omindir to be able to be garrisoned, similar to the sidecar example I gave in Pangea in one of the previous questions. I feel like having the option to basically garrison your Diridris into the Omindir and then ride the Omindir into battle and then ungarrison at a certain point, they probably wouldn't... I don't think they would be targetable, and they wouldn't be able to attack, so it wouldn't be a garrison under normal circumstances, but you would basically be using it as a delivery system. Sort of like how back in the day when people were making Vorvikors more often, I think Shambler described it as it was a Zethrakor delivery system, because it would regress into a Zeth and then deal more damage, but it would gap close and survive that attack. And so it's kind of like that for the Omindir. Like some of the early Omindir will be rideable, I think, and maybe all of them. That might be like a global thing that ground Omindir can have, is that they have like a certain transport capacity for ferrying Diridris units closer to the field. And then obviously some of the greater Omindir could also carry smaller Omindir and stuff like that, right? It wouldn't be like exclusive to Diridris or whatever. So eventually, like the general play pattern would be that the Diridris are not very good at scouting, but can still provide you with really important intel in other ways. So they're not conventional scouts, whereas the Omindir are maybe faster, maybe have better vision range, but they lack the sixth sense that the Diridris provide. And so you want to combine them, obviously, very thematic for the regency. But you also want to be able to, you want to be able to play off each other's strengths. The Diridris are not very stocky, so they're fairly fragile. However, they are the primary source for ranged attacks in the early stages of the game. So they're your anti-air, they're your mid-range and eventual backline. The Omindir will almost never be artillery, but there will be at least one or two of them, and they will be uncharacteristically a little bit on the slower side. I haven't decided if... I think this will end up being a tier 2 Omindir thing, a mid-game Omindir thing. You'll be able to tunnel through walls and stuff like that to scale cliffs. Probably not automatically, probably not without some kind of opportunity cost, like maybe you move much slower during this process, and thus you could be... Maybe the process can't be interrupted because it's like a one-way trip, right? So you're making the decision, and so maybe you could get accosted during that and end up losing some stuff as a result, especially if there's stuff inside the Omindir that is trying to burrow. But you would imagine using that as a way to transport units over a cliff or over a waterbed or something like that. And I think a lot of the thematic aspects of them are definitely going to come down to loading up Doridris units and then having them spill out once the Omindir arrives. I feel like stuff like that is really cool. Another thematic thing that I wanted is that a lot of the Omindir will be able to have small ranged damage. They'll be able to throw small ranged attacks out there from mounted weaponry while they are moving. So the idea that I had was that maybe this will be a tier 2 thing and not available at tier 1, or maybe it'll be like a tier 1.5 thing. But you can imagine like an Omindir serpent that has, say, a bunch of small guns on it that shoot at like nearby targets, and say it has like 4, and they don't deal crazy amounts of damage, and they don't have crazy amounts of attack rate, but it still adds something. And thematically, it's really cool to see them shooting the weaponry while sort of like moving like a fish would move at the top of the water, or a dolphin would move at the water, like going up and then down. And as they're doing it, they're like supposed to be churning up the terrain that they're going through, right? The airborne ones are very weird. They're, I guess some of their movement is kind of similar to, if anybody has seen and remembers the scenes where they have like those giant invasion space whales in Avengers 1. I think they were the Kree or something. I can't remember the race that was named. They were named. The Marvel movies all blend together at some point, but that movement where they very wildly kind of like move up and down. I was thinking of a slightly toned down version of that, and toned down mostly for visuals in an RTS. But I wanted them to sort of like bob and sway up and down like they were swimming through space. And so those ones would be kind of similar in their motions, but they wouldn't be devouring space, because that's sort of like what's happening is that the Omindir are moving and, sure, some of them can move and shoot. I think some of them would be capable of regenerating HP while moving. I don't know if this would be a global thing or not, but I like the idea of the Omindir being stressing mobility and stressing their ability to garrison units and like make up for the slower Doridris, but also benefit from having them, if not inside their holds, at the very least when they're unloaded, to check for like footsteps and stuff and maybe other details, right? And again, in combat, the Doridris would actually serve as some of the more powerful options, assuming they could, consume corpses nearby. Maybe it wouldn't only be Omindir that they can consume. Maybe it would be any corpse. Whereas the Doridris specifically would, when they fall, would be able to empower other units nearby. So the longer the battle goes on, maybe the more it favors the Omindir, the Omindris on average, and that would basically be like the early and middle game sections. The late game, I feel like you're kind of destined to uproot some of your production, some of your Omindiroa, your Omindirons, and turn them into Omindiroa again. I'd love to imagine a world where after you hit a certain tech tier, maybe only certain production structures would have this option, or maybe some of the Omindiron would need to like a special like per thing upgrade or something. And maybe this would be available at the beginning of the game too. I'm not sure. But like imagining basically a mutation or building morph for whatever you want to call it, similar to how Zerg do that, that instead of like turning it into another production structure, it like another level of the structure, it actually uproots it and turns it into an Omindiroa that would allow it to move around and redeploy. But also would, and this is why it would cost some money, it would allow it to be a combat unit in some way. So kind of like a more mobile and thematically interesting and novel thing that I guess the Night Elves in Warcraft 3 had, where they uprooted their treants and stuff. In this particular case, you'd be potentially being able to use your production structures that you didn't want anymore, that got outscaled, or just in a pinch, you'd be able to convert them into and maybe in this process, if I decide not to make this cost of resources, I would make it a one-way trip. So if you do this, they are a combat unit and you can't take it back. You can't put them back again. That could be kind of interesting as well as a decision. And you can imagine a world where you are attempting to do that. And by the way, this would naturally, if we go the other route where you can't turn it back, then we would obviously, if you make that choice at the beginning of the game, you would be giving up the game because you have to have a production structure available, right? So that doesn't really make any sense. I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit awkward if it's available at the start, but I like the idea of basically being able to uproot them and use them in combat. So some of the late game stuff will actually be their structures, funnily enough, mostly because they're pretty tanky and they'll have access to some pretty significant mobility options for the rest of the army. They might move pretty slow, but some of them will be air and some of them will be ground when they convert. And some of them obviously will, they'll have a large cargo hold as well. So that's a pretty cool thing. And obviously there was talk of bonus points, which actually means that Pr0, if I earn the bonus points, he gives me money, which is pretty funny. I would say that the bonus points that about the late game Omindris tech, I'm trying to think if I can earn this, because I've thought about like the tunneling through large pieces of terrain being a big one that when they deploy, I don't know if that would be mid game or late game. I feel like at the very least, like late game means something completely different in Xibalba stuff most of the time. But I do like the idea of basically one of the things that I always wanted in Xibalba was the ability to essentially reshape some of the terrain. And I think that the way that the Omindris do that, which would generally be a late game thing, is they would use the really titanic Omindiron or whatever. They'd like take their structures and turn them back into Omindiroa, or they just build Omindiroa, and they would use these giant metal spawn snake things to eat through the terrain to carve a new path. So they basically be able to, instead of tunneling through the cliff to transport, they would literally be destroying the cliff. And it would probably take a lot of time. Maybe it would cost resources. I don't know how it's going to work out in general. The Ansifi are going to be able to deploy like advanced engineers that can just like demolish cliffs and stuff. And that will allow some of their like super big pavilions and such to make their way through smaller forces, smaller choke points and whatnot. So in some ways, it's kind of like a requirement on some maps, in some cases, if you want to deploy the really big stuff that's like stretches across the screen in terms of its scale. But when it comes to the Omindris, I feel like that's definitely going to be a big one, is just maybe more flexible terrain deformation. And maybe it's only temporary and grows back. I don't exactly know how we'll balance it out. But I definitely want them to be able to eat through the map and create new pathways as a result. And that's pretty much all I got right now. So Pr0 can decide if that's bonus points enough, but I definitely think the Omindris are super epic. I really love them as a concept. Especially the idea, like in my head, I've like envisioned a bunch of CGI cutscenes and stuff. And I remember thinking that like there'd be this battle between like 5 different regencies on the ground of some planet. And then they'd all like, at one by one, their commanders would start to look up and see the incoming metal spawn snake things that are just screaming towards the surface. And they burrow through and release a bunch of Doridris forces and other Omindiron. And the constant like bobbing up and down while the guns are shooting is really thematic to me too. So I love that idea for some of the ground the Omindir. You'll see some cool shit when we get around to that. There you go. So we got another question about Xibalba. It's the Shambler asking for examples of penal soldiers in Xibalba regencies. He adds that he can imagine what Ansifi and Keltar would look like, maybe even Makral Das with mind slaves, but examples from some of the more wild yet still civilized regencies would be appreciated. Well, it's up to you to decide if the Doridris or the Omindris, rather, count in that situation. Obviously, Gadamemter kind of has everybody as mind slaves, but penal colony or penal soldiers, right, is very different. It's like using the dregs of society, using criminals, the criminal element, as soldiers, right? It's a question of, do we even have something like that in some of these other regencies? Just scrolling through the list of regencies, there's a bunch that really wouldn't have it, like the Bithrantir, the Nadarasatha. They don't really have that kind of element, where the Bithrantir are a little bit different because they just are so taken by apathy, because they simply cannot fathom a way out of their existence. The Nadarasatha are a little bit different. The Nadarasatha just execute criminals. They just don't tolerate them, so there's none to use in that sense. And also, what is a criminal to a Nadarasatha type of character is very different than what is a criminal to us. Like, their culture is very different in that sense. The Oros might. These are the electrokinetic lizard people. They are interesting. I don't know if their society would use or validate. I think they would be a society that has some honor culture regarding their soldiers, not to the same extent as the Githrovan or the Keltar, but on the spectrum at the very least, right? And I think they would probably consider penal soldiers they wouldn't have the conception of like, oh, you're going to serve your time and prove your loyalty. I think they're generally less trusting than the Githrovan are of their own kind. The Keltar, in a similar boat, are pretty trusting, even to the point where any crime that you commit is kind of like that's why the mercenary for the Ember Seat that is a Keltar unit is called a disgrace. That's a pretty significant, right? So it's like, dude, that's their kind of culture. Like, they might allow you to serve out your sentence on the front lines, but you'd have to earn that. Like, that's not a privilege gained automatically. So the Oros, I think they'd be a little bit more distrusting of their fellow people, their fellow lizards. They wouldn't necessarily be like, oh yeah, sure, we'll allow that. And we will find a use for you. They are a little bit honor culturally, but they don't have the same level as the Githrovan or as the Keltar. So that's a little bit of info there behind the scenes. Githrovan weren't on the list of things that he could immediately come to mind for. Obviously, the Githrovans have been criticized amongst the other regencies, kind of look of them, and they think to themselves, dude, these guys are like, they try to, they're busybodies or whatever. They try to like control and enforce like peace when all we want to do is shoot each other. What's going on here? These guys are way too idealist. But that doesn't mean that they extend they fully recognize there is an element of practicality to them, where they fully recognize the idea of some people not really being savable, and so not everybody's going to go all the way to the commencement, right? Now, everybody should be trying to do that amongst the Githrovan populace, but if you aren't, then you aren't, and we just don't waste time with you, which is to say that they tend to have exiles more than they have penal soldiers. If somebody does something bad, then their punishment is often not being allowed to, like criminals, if there were to be a criminal element within the Githrovan society, they would simply be disbarred from pursuing the commencement. That would be their sort of ultimate punishment. And so, maybe some more cynical among the Githrovan would use that as an easy get out of jail free card. But at that point, they're out of the Githrovan's hair, so to speak. They just get dismissed. So yeah, the Githrovans don't really have them either, do they? The Ember Seat, a lot of Retons are criminals, still useful. Their numbers are massive. And it's to the point where like the broader Ember Seat sort of coalition governments sometimes will turn a blind eye to the crimes committed by Retons. The same is kind of true for the Askosi, except they're not really criminals amongst Ember Seathi society, whereas Retons can absolutely be. The Askosi tend to be more like, they're very angry, they're very violent, but they might commit what would be known as like war crimes or whatever by the other regencies, but that's not really of the concern of the Ember Seathi. Generally, they're not that concerned about it. So, there you have it for the Ember Seat. At least two of the regencies, or two of the races that are members of the Ember Seat, might be considered criminals by others. Only the Retons are really common as far as criminals within Ember Seathi land. not to say that the other ones don't commit crime, but it's not necessarily like to the point where maybe it's not even it's not blue collar crime. I'll put it to you that way. Oftentimes, it's not like violent crime. Those ones are like, yeah, sure, we'll use you. Like, it doesn't really matter. You're going to be one of like 1,000 that die in this one mission. So, and that's a low estimate, right? Just why not sign up? Let's go. If you somehow survive, or even if you escape in the middle of the battle, you're a complete deserter. There's like 30,000 more ready to take your spot, so it's not really that much of a concern for us. And you'll probably die anyway somewhere else. So they're not very highly valued, I would say. The mind slaves of the Makrodas were definitely a consideration. I wouldn't necessarily think of them as penal soldiers, though, because you're thinking of them as like, these guys are criminals, right? Criminal Makrolon are like, you don't really get them. Their justice system is a little sociopathic, right? Like, I've talked about the Makrodasas for a while now, and people kind of know that, like, okay, these dudes are like, they're fully aquatic, and they mind control things, and they think of themselves as every individual Makrodas has the potential, every individual Makrolon has the potential to become the emperor of their local empire. It's just a question of how well can you play the political game of snakes and ladders. And even describing it as that doesn't really tell you all you need to know. When it comes to the Makrolon and their very strange society, they don't have any ill will towards you when you inevitably stab them in the back. They think of it as, I should have been better at anticipating that. And it'll almost be like in the latest version of, the latest Denis Villeneuve film as of the time of recording, Dune Part 2, where one of the characters says, "You fought well, Atreides." It's like, okay, they'll acknowledge it, regardless of what the outcome was. There, I tried to shield it from spoilers. You should see it. It's a movie worth watching. When it comes to the other regencies that are civilized, I guess you could think of the Psychora. There weren't really criminal elements among them because they're beset upon by total war back in their home dimension. When it comes to this dimension, though, sometimes the pain of the symmetry sickness can really hurt them to the point where maybe they will sometimes have people who act out. They won't use them for soldiers. In fact, they usually are seeing that as like a dishonorable discharge, I guess, where it's a medical discharge in some ways, but if they do something wrong in that period of time where they're under extreme duress and suffering, that would be a situation where they'll return home and be somewhat disgraced when they're back into their home dimension. Just going through the rest of the list here, seeing if there's anything that pops out at me. Obviously, the Rune are kind of criminal by nature as well. So as of right now, it doesn't look like anybody's using penal soldiers in Xibalba besides, Ansifi, some Keltar. I don't think any Githrovin, but maybe there's some wiggle room there. And of course the Embraceet. Everything else, not really, right? Not really. So, maybe some of the Makrolon could eventually be construed as like being, what would you call it? Maybe some of them, instead of mind slaves, it could be that you've offended this particular leader of the Makrodas, like this particular commander. So you will serve in his platoon as like a disgraced, individual and then your service is done. Like it's committed at that point. So maybe that's like something that could be constituted, but it's very informal compared to the sort of more conventional system you might imagine for human societies. So hopefully that answered Shambler's question adequately. And we'll move on to our final question of the show. We're going to be answering Chumbeque's question here. He asks, a lot of shape language went into the design of StarCraft, taking into consideration it just happened to be 3 races. AKA, Terran buildings are all blocky, Protoss buildings have rounded edges, and Zerg buildings are kind of triangular and spiky. How much of this has been put into consideration during the design of the new Cosmonarchy visuals, and are there any plans to find a new visual identity when the Askosi get implemented? So I would say that generally we like the shape language of the existing stuff, but it's a little bit schizo. It doesn't really commit to one thing. There's a lot of spiky elements of the Protoss. I'm thinking the Warden and the Gateway come to mind. Obviously the Pylon as well. There's a lot of spikes there, but it's materially different than the like material-wise. It looks very different than the Zerg, and it doesn't look organic. It doesn't breathe like the Zerg structures do, so that helps. And of course the the shape part of it is very distinct from a lot of the Terran arsenal, which is very gray as well, militarily wise. It's chrome or whatever. And then you think about the Terran stuff. I don't know if blocky is the right word, but I guess I can see where he's coming from, describing things like the stockade or, well, the barracks, right? I'm thinking about the original names now. So the command center is just I don't know what the fuck the command center even is. It's just a weird looking shape. The academy is just what. The armory is just what. So yeah, there's a lot of things that whether they're blocky, whether they're spiky, whether they're rounded, the materials are still pretty different, and that definitely helps as well. So one of the first things that I try to do for the Askosi is try to imagine, okay, we're going to have different architecture, like shape language, but we're also going to have different colors. The thunder may be audible in the background, by the way. It's a good sign that I need to close up shop here in a moment. But the idea for me was that the Askosi would have, these sort of concentric circles and a lot of like Tesla coil-esque shapes where they're maybe almost like looking like springs in some way, metal springs in like the same sort of rotating fashion that's where like the concentric idea comes from. Circles within circles a lot of the time. And that's one of the vibes. I'd love to have them be very green, like a lot of dark green or rich green, but the palette is a little limited in that, so I'm not sure if we'll be able to achieve that. But color is definitely one, and of course the idea of them having all of these more circular aspects, like they might be arranged in a more blocky fashion, similar to the Terran structures and shape language, but because the layout is kind of like that, but the curvy and concentric circle nature of a lot of their architecture is so different than everything else. I think that will help. And again, the materials, they'll probably use a lot of brighter achromatics, like bright chrome, like white, pearly, stuff like that, in terms bone white, stuff like that for the colors. And then, we'll have some, maybe some dull blue, some faded brown, definitely some green. And we'll see where we can go from there. So there's definitely been some thoughts as to how to separate them visually in terms of their architecture, right? And when it comes to their vehicles, I hope to be able to embody some of that as well. When it comes to the other races, though, the new Cosmonarchy visuals, the portion of the question that's not related to the Askosi directly, yeah, I've tried to analyze what are commonalities between a lot of the Protoss designs and a lot of the Zerg designs and a lot of the Terran designs, and I've tried to write my text descriptions and model my stuff in similar elements to that. Like I try to, generally speaking, match the idea that like, okay, we're going to make the Terran vehicles and they're going to be made of like, fairly, parts that you can imagine working together. I don't know, wouldn't necessarily want to say modular, but there's like sheet metal aspects to it, evocative of sheet metal construction. There's definitely like, here's how you would stamp these things together and here's how you would equip them. It's just like a more futuristic idea of like the size of what you're putting together. The pieces can be bigger, stuff like that. Definitely like the idea of them remaining somewhat blocky in their design, just similar to the buildings, although the buildings I feel like the buildings could be a lot better for the default Terran stuff. Like the original StarCraft assets for those they're just unintelligible. I don't know what I'm looking at. The remastered models did not help either. So very, very strange. So there's that. For Protoss, there's been a big pain point of the epigraph having barrels and the Atreus and Optecton having turrets. I've talked about this a bunch of times. How the new infantry graphics like Legionnaire and Adherent need to have like their weapons integrated into their arms so that they have like, even if it's just one spear, maybe the Legionnaire can hold, his other hand can be equipped with like a transponder type thing that indicates how he's teleporting, stuff like that could work. And then his other wrist could be the one that carries the spear, the lance or whatever. That would be one option. And then the Adherent would simply have, I would imagine he would have like he would have to kind of hold his hand, clasp his hands together a lot of the time so that his blades fuse together into one or something like that. Maybe that could be kind of interesting to think about. Even if it's just on one arm, though, he can kind of walk around similar to the Amaranth, right, in its current form, stuff like that. So there's like shape language improvements we can make to some of the existing assets, and some of the other stuff we can just build up over time. As far as like updating to the new format, like a lot of the Zerg assets are very placeholder, and eventually they'll look a lot better when they use similar materials and they echo designs of previous Zerg units. Like the Quasilisk looks like a Zethicor graphic in some ways. It looks like a Zerg graphic would look Zethicor-wise if we were to remodel that. Or maybe there's some similarities to the Hydralisk in it or something like that, right? So being able to have some echoes there, I think, is good. So a lot of thought has been put into it. Maybe we haven't been the most successful in the format of it in terms of deploying it. That's for other people to decide and for us to continue to improve on. But that is sort of where I come down on that. And there has definitely been some thoughts put into the Askosi and put into the existing assets that need to be updated in the future. Thanks for your questions, sir. We are now at the show outro. The show is over. Pr0totype episode 56. I thought this was a really nice one. Obviously, it's a very long one. It took a long time on the questions, the donator questions. Appreciate you guys and your support. As mentioned, the coffee section has been updated. You can check that out and provide more support or even less support if you want. If you're already on there, but you want to downsize to your Q3A instead or whatever. Whatever you want to do, just be aware of it, please, so that you don't feel like we pulled the rug out from under you real fast. Definitely pay attention to that. We will be timing out phasing out the one-time donos for coffee perks, but we still appreciate those one-time donos if they come in. And when they come in, they are helpful, just like the monthly ones. But just gotta get rid of the administrative task of like constantly thinking, how many months has this person earned by donating this much or whatever? Just not dealing with that, basically. But hey, we appreciate all the people who have donated. You'll still get the fancy, donator tag or whatever. That is appreciated. You just won't necessarily have the same perks starting maybe next month or something. And other than that, of course, as the coffee link vanishes from the bottom left, let me just say that I appreciate everybody who is still checking out Cosmonarchy. I appreciate everybody who's playing constantly. I love that we casted an FFA recently. That's really hype. We'll be back with more work, more casts, more pods, and more progress, as always. GG.